The stars were silent. A vast emptiness stretched across the galaxy, and in the middle of it all, the planet Zalran 4 spun slowly in the cold of deep space. To any ordinary observer, it would look like just another uninhabited world, untouched and forgotten. But that was before the SOS came through. It wasn't supposed to be anything important, just another routine scan, another signal picked up from the vastness of space. The Zarkorian Federation, known for its diplomatic strength and peaceful nature, had received countless distress calls before. Most of them came from small, insignificant species asking for help with local threats.
Oh.
But this one was different. This time, something was wrong, deeply wrong. At first, Captain Alara of the Zarkorian fleet thought it was just a malfunction. After all, strange signals often drifted through space. A flicker here, a burst of static there, wasn't uncommon. But as her crew began decoding the message, she felt a cold sense of unease. "Captain, you need to see this," her communications officer Zeryl said, his voice tense. He was a young officer, new to the fleet, and his usual calm demeanor had been replaced with clear anxiety. Alara stood up from her chair, her uniform rustling as she moved across the bridge. The soft hum of the ship's engines filled the air. As she approached the officer's console, she peered over his shoulder as the decoded message blinked on the screen. "Help us. We are under attack. Deathworlders are here. Send help, please, please." The message was short, but its implications were chilling. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was desperation. The word Deathworlders echoed in Alara's mind. She had heard rumors, heard stories whispered in dark corners of the galaxy. But she never thought she'd see a day when those stories would be more than just legend. She knew that name. Deathworlders, a species so feared that they were almost considered myth. The name alone sent shivers down her spine. No one knew much about them except for one undeniable fact. They didn't just conquer, they destroyed. Alara stepped back, her mind racing. She had to make a decision, and quickly. The fleet had been stationed for months on a peacekeeping mission, far from Earth and far from any real threats. And now this. "Send a message to the Federation Council," Alara ordered, her voice sharp. "Tell them to prepare a diplomatic response. I want all possible support sent immediately. We're going to Zalran 4. The Zarkorian Federation was known for its diplomatic approach. They believed in peace, in negotiations, in compromise. Alara had spent years cultivating this ideal, holding the belief that no conflict was too big to be solved with words. But this felt different. As she walked back to her command seat, her mind spun with questions. Who were the Deathworlders? How had they found this peaceful, uninhabited world? Why were they here? Was it a mistake? Had Zalran 4 crossed into their territory? Or was something more sinister at play? The fleet slowly adjusted its course. It would take them several days to reach Zalran 4, but Alara couldn't shake the feeling that every second that passed was one, where the galaxy was inching closer to the edge of something horrific. Meanwhile, light years away, or far across the galaxy on the planet Eris, a dark council sat in a dimly lit chamber. The room was filled with holographic images of distant worlds, their surfaces flickering like dying stars. The Erisians, an ancient race of scholars and tacticians, watched the unfolding events with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Do you believe them?" one of the counselors, Thessal, asked, his voice deep and calculated. The image of Zalran 4 blinked on the screen, an eerie image of the world slowly turning in the blackness of space. "The Zarkorians are sending a fleet." The cell continued, his eyes narrowing. "But what if the Deathworlders are not just a threat to Zalran 4? What if they are coming for us all?" Another counselor, Larise, leaned forward, his face grim. "We've been watching this from the beginning. The Deathworlders are not to be underestimated, but we've been too afraid to act. It's maybe our last chance to understand them, to warn the rest of the galaxy. We cannot stay silent any longer." The council nodded in agreement. They had been waiting for something like this. It wasn't fear that gripped them, it was knowledge. They knew that if the Deathworlders were coming, nothing could stop them. Back on the Zarkorian fleet, the days passed, and the fleet continued its journey to Zalrun 4. Tensions were high, and the crew could feel it. It wasn't just the mission. It wasn't just the unknown threat of the Deathworlders. It was something more primal. Something deep within them that said, "We are not ready for this." Alara stood on the bridge, staring out into the endless expanse of space. The stars seemed distant, unreachable, almost mocking in their stillness. "Captain, we're approaching?" "Zalren, IV," Zarel's voice broke the silence. Ilara nodded, steeling herself. "This is it." She turned to her officers. "Prepare for arrival, and be ready for anything." The ship entered the Zalran 4 system. But as the stars around them began to shift, something was off. The once beautiful world of Zalran the Fourth was now a war zone. Smoke rose from the surface, dark and thick. As massive explosions rocked the planet's atmosphere, "Activate the visual feed," Lara ordered, her voice steady but betraying a hint of dread. The holographic projection above the command center flickered to life, showing a live view of Zalran 4. The surface of the planet was scarred. Massive craters pockmarked the landscape, while dark clouds churned above, full of ash and destruction. "What in the universe happened here?" Lara whispered under her breath. Zarl's voice came through again, shaking. "Captain, there are no signs of life." Suddenly, the communication system crackled. A cold, distorted voice echoed through the bridge, making every hair on the crew's neck stand on end. "This is your only warning. Leave this system, or your fate will be the same as those who begged for help." The message ended abruptly, leaving only silence in its wake. Suspense builds. Ilara's heart pounded. The Deathworlders were here. And they weren't just a threat, they were the end of everything. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, fear settling in.
Ow.
There was no going back now. The SOS that had started this mission was a call for help, but it had become a warning. And it was clear now that the galaxy was about to change forever. Ilara took a deep breath.
Ow.
Prepare for battle. The Zarkorian fleet hung motionless in the cold, infinite expanse of space. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional hum of the ship's engines and the low murmur of the crew members at their stations. Captain Ilara stood at the command center, staring out at the swirling clouds of smoke and debris that surrounded Zalran. IV, the images on the holographic display flickered with distressing clarity. The once beautiful world was now scarred, its atmosphere thick with ash and firestorms. The planet's surface was barely visible through the smoke, and massive explosions shook the very core of the planet. There were no signs of life, nothing but destruction. Elara's chest tightened as the enormity of the situation became more and more apparent. She could feel her crew's unease growing, like a heavy weight in the air. Something wasn't right. "Captain, we're receiving another transmission." Zarel's voice broke through the silence. His hands hovered over his console, his face pale with worry. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. The last transmission had been chilling, and it was clear that whoever or whatever had sent it wasn't interested in diplomacy. The Zarkorian fleet had come as a peacekeeping force, but that plan was crumbling fast. "Put it through," Ilara ordered, her voice calm, though her mind raced. The comms panel flickered to life. "Okay." And once again, a cold, distorted voice filled the bridge. "You've entered the domain of the Deathworlders. Leave now, or your fate will be the same as the others." The message was brief, its threat clear. There was no plea for help this time, no desperation in the voice, just a promise of destruction. Zarel's hand trembled as he adjusted the settings. "I'm tracing the signal, Captain. It's coming from the planet's surface, deep within the ruins. It's coming from a fortress." "A fortress," Lara repeated, her mind trying to piece together the fragments of the puzzle. A fortress? On Zalran 4? Didn't make sense. The planet was a simple, peaceful world, known for its untouched landscapes and peaceful inhabitants. Why would the Deathworlders choose a ruined fortress as their base? What had happened here? Captain Zarel continued. "I'm detecting massive gravitational distortions in the area. We're being pulled in. Can't escape this pull without risking major damage." Ilara's pulse quickened. It was a trap. They'd walked straight into it. The Deathworlders weren't just lying in wait. They were luring them closer. Every step the fleet took was a step deeper into a web of violence and destruction. Deploy. Shields, increase our speed, Lara barked, trying to keep her composure. Her voice was steady, but inside her stomach twisted. The bridge crew scrambled to follow her orders. But no matter how fast they tried to move, the gravitational pull grew stronger, the darkness of space seeming to close in on them. It wasn't just the pull of the planet, it was something more. The Deathworlders were prepared for this moment. Ilara turned to her tactical officer, Lena, who was already analyzing the situation. Captain, the planet is generating its own gravitational field, much stronger than anything we've encountered. It's like they're using the planet itself as a weapon. Can we counter it? Ilara asked, trying to maintain control. Lena hesitated. Possibly, but it will take time. We might not have that long. As if to answer her question, a massive shockwave rippled through the fleet. The ship groaned under the pressure, and the lights flickered. Ilara gripped the edge of her command chair to steady herself. Report, she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Zarl's face was pale, his fingers flying across the console. The gravity well is increasing. Captain, we're being sucked toward the surface of Zalron for... Brace for impact, Ilara commanded. The next few moments were a blur. The ship rocked violently as if gripped by invisible hands. The sound of alarms blared in the background, mixing with the pounding in Ilara's chest. Her hands tightened. Around the armrests, her knuckles white. As she forced herself to focus, through the violent shaking of the ship, Ilara caught a glimpse of the outside. The Deathworlders' fleet, a terrifying sight. Ships that dwarfed even the Zarkorian battleships. The Deathworlders weren't just a threat, they were the threat. The fleet captain could hear the low hum of an approaching force, something massive and relentless. A dark shadow passed over them, and Ilara's breath caught in her throat. The Deathworlders had arrived. Zarl was the first to speak, his voice quivering.
Captain, they're already here.
Outside the skies of Zalron for darkened further. From the shadow of the Deathworlder fleet, large warships descended. Their dark silhouettes like the jaws of a massive beast, hungry and unyielding. On the screen, the gargantuan warship's engines flared to life, burning bright with red energy. It was unlike anything Ilara had ever seen. A ship built for destruction, massive in size and terrifying in its design. The sheer presence of the craft seemed to darken the surrounding stars. Ilara felt her pulse quicken. The Deathworlders had not come to negotiate. They had come to dominate. Captain, their ships are opening fire, Lena shouted, panic creeping into her voice. The fleet's shields flared brightly as the first blast of energy slammed into them. The Zarkorian fleet shook violently, throwing crew members to the ground. Ilara's mind raced. The Deathworlders were not like the Zarkorians, or any species they had encountered before. There was no negotiation. No plea for mercy, only the raw, unyielding violence of their ships. And now they were facing it head-on. All hands to battle. Stations! Ilara shouted. Prepare for evasive maneuvers. We are not retreating. Not yet. The crew scrambled into action, but the feeling of hopelessness began to settle in like a cold fog. The Deathworlders weren't here to talk. They were here to crush. Captain Ilara had just realized the horrifying truth. This was just the beginning. The Zarkorian fleet's shields flared under the relentless assault of the Deathworlder ships. The air on the bridge of the flagship crackled with tension. The once pristine, invincible ships of the Zarkorian fleet were now just pawns in a game. They couldn't win. Captain Ilara's knuckles whitened as her hands gripped the command chair. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the very existence of her people. The Deathworlders, in their brutal efficiency, were determined to wipe out any trace of the Zarkorians, and they were doing so with terrifying ease. Shields are holding at 20%, Captain, Zarel shouted, his voice urgent. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his fingers flying across the console as the ship rocked under another powerful hit. The massive shadow of the Deathworlder warship continued to loom. Over them, It was like a living thing, a creature of destruction, its weapons aimed with terrifying precision. It wasn't just attacking the Zarkorian fleet, it was systematically taking them apart piece by piece. Return fire. Full power to all weapons. Alara barked. The Zarkorian fleet had no chance of escaping, and they weren't strong enough to withstand this much longer. Their only hope was to strike back to at least make the Deathworlders realize they weren't as easy to kill as they thought. The Zarkorian flagship fired, its weapons tearing through the void, but it was a futile effort. The Deathworlders' ships dodged with unsettling agility, and their own weapons fired again. The force of the blast shook the ship like a toy in the hands of a child. "Captain, we're losing power to the engines. Won't be able to evade much longer." Lena, the tactical officer, cried out, her face pale with fear. The lights flickered again, and the hum of the engines grew weaker. Ilara's mind raced. They couldn't keep this up. Not with the Deathworlders pressing in from every direction, with their warships so much larger, more advanced, and deadly than anything the Zarkorians had ever faced. The situation was turning from bad to worse. The crew's resolve was beginning to crack under the pressure, and yet Ilara didn't give in. She couldn't. Not while her people still had breath left in them. "Hold steady," Ilara shouted, her voice fierce. "We will not go down without a fight. Fire all remaining weapons. Give them everything we've got." The Zarkorian flagship's weapons unleashed a barrage of energy that lit up the space around them. But it was like throwing rocks at a mountain. The Deathworlder ships barely flinched, their shields absorbing the blast with ease. They had no need for mercy, no need for hesitation. It had come to conquer. And they would not stop until the Zarkorian fleet was nothing but a memory. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest as another violent explosion rocked the ship. The Deathworlders were closing in on them, too fast. She could feel it in her bones. The end was near. The fleet was being torn apart, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But as she looked out the forward viewport, something caught her eye, something that made her blood run cold. A ship, no, not just a ship, a warship appeared. From the depths of the chaos, it was smaller than the Deathworlder battleships, but powerful in its own right. Its engines burned a brilliant blue, and its weapons crackled with energy. It shot forward with the speed and aggression of a predator on the hunt. "What is that?" Zarel gasped, his voice full of confusion and disbelief. Ilara squinted, trying to make sense of the anomaly. It wasn't a Zarkorian ship. It wasn't a Deathworlder ship. It was something else entirely. It was coming for them. As the mysterious warship closed the distance, the Deathworlder ships momentarily paused their assault. For a fleeting moment, the guns stopped firing. The massive Deathworlder vessels turned their attention to the newcomer in the skies above Zalran 4. "Captain, we're being hailed." Zarel's voice came through, tinged with urgency. "It's the new ship. They're sending a transmission." "Put it through," Lara ordered, her heart racing with anticipation. Who could this be? Were they friend or foe? The transmission screen flickered to life in the face that appeared made. Ilara's blood ran cold. The figure on the screen was humanoid, but massive, towering over the holographic display. Its features were partially obscured by dark armor, but its eyes glowed with an unmistakable, fierce intensity. "I am Commander Rinner of the Solari Ascendants." The figure spoke, its voice deep and resonant. "You are under our protection." Now, Ilara's mind struggled to comprehend what she was hearing. The Solari Ascendants. She had never heard of them before. Were they an ally? An enemy? And how had they come to know of the Zarkorian fleet? Before she could respond, the commander continued. "The Deathworlders are not your saviors, Captain. They are the executioners. But you," Rinner's voice carried a grim edge, "have made a fatal mistake in crossing their path. If you wish to survive, you must listen closely. We are your only chance." Ilara's heart raced. Survival. They had already been pushed to the brink of destruction. How could anyone possibly save them now? "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the panic that was growing in her chest. The commander's eyes glinted. "Your fleet is outmatched, but we can offer you something the Deathworlders cannot." He paused for a long, tension-filled moment. A way out. As the words sank in, Alara couldn't believe what she was hearing. A way out? Was this a trick? Or was it the only hope left for her people? Prepare your ship. We will guide you to safety. But you must trust us, Commander Rinner added, the gravity of his words hanging heavily in the air. Alara stood frozen, her mind spinning. This was the moment of truth, a choice that could determine the fate of her fleet, her people, her entire civilization. Would they trust this mysterious figure? Or would they face the Deathworlders alone? The Zarkorian flagship was on the brink of collapse. The ship groaned under the strain of relentless energy blasts, its hull blackened in places from the barrage of weapons. The once pristine vessel was now battered, its crew desperate. Captain? Alara stood rigid, staring at the flickering holographic display of Commander Rinner. His ominous, glowing eyes were still fixed on her, his words cutting through the chaos of the battle. Prepare your ship. We will guide you to safety. Ilara's pulse hammered in her chest. The Deathworlder ships continued to encircle them, their presence an almost suffocating weight in the space around them. The massive Deathworlder warship loomed like a silent predator, waiting for the Zarkorian fleet to falter completely before delivering the final blow. The Solari Ascendants. Alara's instincts screamed to distrust them, but their offer, the only offer left, was all that stood between her people and annihilation. Why should we trust you? Alara asked, her voice cold but steady. She had to be cautious. They had already made one mistake in trusting others. She couldn't afford to make another. Commander Rinner's expression remained unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, a spark of genuine intent that made Alara pause. You don't have much of a choice. Captain Rinner replied, his voice tinged with a quiet finality. The Deathworlders are no allies. They will leave nothing of your fleet. If you want to survive, I can offer you a chance. But it's not without risk. We cannot hold off the Deathworlders forever. Alara's mind raced. What could they offer that would change the tide? She looked around at the faces of her crew, her people. They had already given everything. The ships were nearly destroyed. Their shields were failing. The enemy was closing in, but then a spark of hope. If the Solari Ascendants could truly deliver on their promise, they could be the key to the Zarkorian survival. The risk was high, but the alternative was certain death. What do we have to lose? Lena whispered under her breath from the tactical station. Alara turned sharply, meeting the eyes of her senior officers. No. They were all looking at her, waiting for her decision. Their lives rested in her hands. I'll take the risk. Alara's voice cut through the tension, her resolve unwavering. Set a course for the Solari Ascendants. The bridge fell silent as the crew scrambled to execute the order. The Zarkorian flagship lurched as its engines ignited with what little power they had left, and they began to drift toward the point where the mysterious Solari Ascendant fleet had appeared. You have made the right choice. Rinner's voice came again, his tone almost reassuring. Yet the underlying threat of their situation still hung in the air. Just as Alara was about to give the order for the jump to FTL space, another explosion rocked the ship. The shields flickered, barely holding. The Deathworlder fleet was not letting them go. Captain, we have incoming fire. Multiple ships in pursuit, Lena shouted, her voice shrill with panic. We can't escape. We can't make the jump. Alara's eyes burned with determination. Not now. Not when they were this close. Shut down non-essential systems, Alara ordered. Prepare for emergency warp jump. I don't care if we jump in half the system. Just get us out of here. The engines hummed again, and the Zarkorian flagship surged forward, but the Deathworlders weren't far behind. Their ships followed relentlessly, weaving through the debris of the fallen Zarkorian ships as they surged forward with frightening speed. The gap was closing too quickly. Jump in 10. 9, 8, Zero counted off, his voice laced with tension. But as the countdown reached 3, the Deathworlder warships released their final, devastating volley. It wasn't just a laser or energy blast. It was a concentrated death ray, designed to tear apart anything in its path. "Brace for impact," Ilara shouted, her heart in her throat. The beam slammed into the flagship's side with the force of a meteor strike. The ship's hull buckled, and the entire structure groaned as the shields collapsed in a deafening screech. Ilara was thrown from her chair, and the ground seemed to fall away beneath her. She gritted her teeth as she crawled back to her command chair. Her head pounding, "Captain, we're losing structural integrity." She had no time left. "Do it now," she screamed at Zeril. "Jump now." In that instant, the engines flared. The Zarkorian flagship disappeared into the depths of space, leaving the Deathworlders' fire behind. The stars stretched into lines as the ship jumped into faster-than-light travel. Yet, the jump was a blur. Suddenly, it stopped. The jump completed, and the ship came to a sudden, quiet halt. They were out of the battle zone. They had escaped, but at what cost? Ilara staggered to her feet, feeling the intense pressure in her chest as her mind tried to process what had just happened. The damage to the ship was catastrophic. Several decks had been breached. Crew members were injured. Yet ... they were alive. "We made it ... Lena whispered, her voice trembling. But Ilara didn't feel the relief. She should have. The Deathworlders were still out there. Or if this was just the beginning of something far worse. "Where are we?" Zeril asked, his eyes scanning the sensors. The Solari Ascendant fleet appeared. On the scanners, their ships looming in the distance, powerful and imposing. They had kept their word. They had saved them. "For now, they're waiting for us," Ilara said quietly, her mind still processing. But were they really here too? Help? Or were they just another part of the storm that was about to tear everything apart? The silence in the bridge of the Zakorian flagship was almost suffocating. Captain Ilara stood at the command console, staring out at the fleet of Solari Ascendant warships that surrounded them. Their towering armored vessels were unlike anything she had seen before, beautiful, yet terrifying in their advanced design. Their engines hummed with an otherworldly power, and their weapon systems seemed primed for annihilation. The crew had been given medical attention, and many of the wounded were being treated in the lower decks. But despite their survival, Ilara's mind raced with one question that refused to leave her. What now? They were barely holding on. And now, after barely escaping one enemy, they were under the protection of another, unknown force. "Where are we, Captain?" Zeril asked, his voice quieter than usual. The shock of what they had survived was settling in. Ilara looked out of the viewport. Beyond the vast expanse of stars, the Solari Ascendant ships were positioned in a protective formation. But there was something unsettling about their presence. They had arrived just in time, but why? And what did they want in return for their help? "We're safe." "For now," Ilara replied, though her tone was less confident than she would have liked. As the ship drifted closer to the Solari Ascendant flagship, the eerie silence was broken by a sudden transmission. His form towering and imposing even through the holographic projection. His eyes locked with Ilara's, filled with something she couldn't quite decipher. "You've made it this far," Rinner's voice came through, calm and cold. What did he mean by that? "We came for refuge," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "You said you could offer us safety." Rinner's eyes glinted. "Safety," he repeated. "Yes, I can give you that. But there's something you should understand. The Deathworlders are not your only threat." Ilara's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" The screen crackled, and Reiner's face became more intense. His eyes narrowed, and Ilara could see the weight of the truth he was about to reveal. "The Deathworlders are a tool, a weapon." Renar's voice dropped low. "A weapon used by forces far greater than you can imagine. You and your people are caught in the middle of something that has been planned for centuries." Ilara's mind raced. What was he saying? You, your fleet, your species are? "Peace in a much larger game," Raynor continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "The Deathworlders were sent to eradicate you. They were just the first wave." Ilara stumbled back, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. "Who sent them?" she whispered. Renner's lips curled into a grim smile. The true enemies are those who remain in the shadows, the syndicates. They are the ones who control the galaxy from behind the scenes. And you, Captain Alara, and your people are the next target in their long list. The words hit Alara like a physical blow. The syndicates? She had heard of them. In passing whispers from distant traders and smugglers, but never in her worst nightmares did she imagine that they were the ones behind it all. The Deathworlders were never your real enemies, Captain, Renner continued. They were simply sent to weaken you. But now you have two choices. You can either remain in the shadows, constantly hunted by the syndicates, or you can fight. With us, with the Solari Ascendants, the room went cold. Fight. Lar had barely survived one battle. Her people were broken. Her fleet was on the verge of collapse. How could she possibly fight against a force that had the power to wipe them out without even breaking a sweat? But then a thought flickered in her mind, a thought she could not ignore. What choice did she have? The syndicates were coming, and they were likely far more dangerous than the Deathworlders ever were. Alara turned to her crew. They were all looking at her now, waiting for her to speak. She could see the exhaustion in their eyes. They had all seen the devastation the Deathworlders had caused. But there was something else, something more powerful than fear or despair. There was hope. What happens if we fight? Alara asked, her voice low, but filled with the weight of what she knew needed to be said. Renner's face softened ever so slightly. If you fight, you stand a chance at surviving. You will never be free of the syndicates, but you will have a chance to make your own fate. Join us, and together, we will strike at the heart of their power. Alara looked back at her people. They had come so far. Did they join the Solari Ascendants and face the syndicates? Or did they continue to run? She could see the glint of determination in their eyes. They were tired, they were wounded, but they were not broken. We fight, Alara said finally. We fight, and we take the fight to them. For the Zarkorians, for the galaxy. A ripple of energy seemed to pass through the bridge, and the crew nodded in silent agreement. They were united in their decision. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming their future. Prepare for war, Alara said, her voice steady now. We have allies. We will take the fight to the syndicates, no matter the cost. Renner's face remained stoic. Then let it begin. And no matter what lay ahead, Captain Alara and the Zakorian fleet would face it together. As the Solari Ascendant's fleet began to maneuver, preparing for the next phase of the battle, Alara knew one thing for certain. The fight was just beginning. The galaxy was about to change forever, and the Zarkorians would be at the heart of that change. The Zarkorian fleet was no longer just a peacekeeping force. It had become a target, a helpless pawn caught in the Deathworlders' deadly game. Captain Alara stood frozen at the center of the bridge, staring out at the massive shadow of the Deathworlder warship that loomed above them. It was a monster of metal, covered in jagged edges. Bristling with weapons that gleamed like the teeth of a predator, her mind raced, trying to process the reality of the situation. The Deathworlders weren't just invaders. They weren't even just conquerors. They were killers unstoppable. Merciless killers who lived for one purpose, annihilation. As the first blast of energy slammed into the shields of the Zarkorian flagship, Lada was jolted out of her thoughts. The bridge shuddered under the pressure, and the lights flickered. Captain Shields holding at 50%. Lena, the tactical officer, shouted, her voice strained with urgency. Increase shield strength. Full power to the engines. Alara ordered, trying to maintain control, though her own body was tense. Every muscle taut, the Deathworlder ship wasn't slowing down. It was closing in, inch by inch. And with each second, the odds grew slimmer that the Zarkorians would survive this encounter. They're not just fighting us, Zeril said quietly, his eyes glued to the display. They're testing us. Like an animal toying with its prey, Alara's heart sank. Zeril was right. The Deathworlders weren't rushing to destroy them. They were methodically pulling the fleet into their web. There was no urgency in their actions, no fear in their movements. It was like the galaxy wasn't just witnessing a war. It was witnessing execution. The first volley of fire from the Deathworlders' warship struck the Zarkorian flagship again, sending a massive shockwave through the vessel. The walls trembled, and the bridge lights flickered again. Alara had to grip the edge of her console to stay steady. "Captain," Sorel shouted from his station, his voice full of alarm. They're locking onto us with a tractor beam. They're pulling us in." Alara's eyes narrowed. A tractor beam. They weren't just fighting, they were preparing to board. Deploy evasive maneuvers. She shouted, her voice thick with urgency, but it was too late. The tractor beam clamped onto the Zarkorian flagship like an unyielding grip, pulling the massive vessel toward the larger Deathworlder warship. The crew members scrambled to their stations, their faces painted with fear, but there was no escaping it. The Zarkorian fleet was trapped. As the Zarkorian flagship was dragged through the void toward the Deathworlder vessel, Lyra's mind was a whirlwind. How had they come to this? What had gone wrong? There had to be something she could do. Anything. The Zarkorian fleet had come in peace, yet here they were, enslaved by a species that had no mercy. "Captain?" Zarl's voice snapped her out of her thoughts again. His hands moved frantically over his console. "The other ships, 3 of them have already lost their shields. They're being overwhelmed. They won't survive much longer if this continues." Alara clenched her fists in frustration. This was not how it was supposed to be. The Deathworlders were supposed to be a myth. A fear whispered among the stars. They weren't supposed to be real. They weren't supposed to be this. "Captain, there's a signal incoming. It's from the surface of Zalrun." 4. Zarl added, his voice laced with a mix of confusion and shock. "Put it through." Alara's voice was sharp, filled with both curiosity and dread. The holographic display flickered, and the face that appeared was not one of the usual diplomatic envoys or survivors. They were not the faces she expected. The face before her was an alien. Yes. But something far more terrifying. It was a Deathworlder. The creature was large, almost towering in the projection, with thick, scarred skin that seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. Its eyes glowed, brilliant red, and its expression was something far beyond malice. It was hunger pure, brutal hunger, and the voice that came through the speakers was chilling. "You are the last to fall," the Deathworlder continued, its voice low, its tone like an animal's growl. "We have given you a chance to leave. You will not. Now, we shall show you how we take what is ours." Alara felt a cold sweat bead on her forehead. This was no mere military force. These creatures were animals, but they were also masters of war. Their words, their presence, it was as if the very act of speaking was meant to crush the spirit of any who dared face them. The image flickered and then disappeared, leaving the bridge in silence. "What do we do now, Captain?" Zarl asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For the first time since this nightmare began, Alara's mind seemed to clear. There was no diplomacy left, no chance for peace. The Deathworlders were here to destroy them, and nothing would stop them. Alara turned to face her crew. "Prepare for battle," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. We fight to survive." But deep down, a part of her wondered, would they survive? The Deathworlders had already shown their true nature. There was no hope for escape, no possibility of retreat. The only path forward was through fire, and Captain Alara could only pray that the Zarkorians would be strong enough to withstand it. The first wave of Deathworlder ships fired again, sending another barrage of energy into the fleet. The battle had begun.